Right, Anna? We're gonna get started.
Yeah, you're ready to go.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Brazil Seminar, launched by Professor Albert Fischlo, who's here with us, honoring with his presence tonight. The Brazil Seminar has been a preeminent forum where leading scholars, senior government officials, representatives of multilateral organizations, and distinguished members of civil society have come to Colombia to engage in an open dialogue with the academic community. Over time, some of the discussions have centered around specific themes, whereas others prioritized broader issues. In the context of multilateralism, tonight, we are here reconciling both perspectives, addressing Brazil's foreign policy towards the United Nations since the organization's inception up to present day. Brazil is the country that has opened the general debate of the United Nations General Assembly every year since 1949. Besides the symbolism, the event reflects the country's vocation and aspiration as a major actor in the international arena. Even though a permanent seat at the Security Council has been one of the primary goals of Brazilian diplomacy, other topics such as sustainable development, trade liberalization, and human rights have been traditionally part of Brazil's foreign relations agenda. To kick off the debate, it is with great pleasure that I welcome Ambassador Ronaldo Costa Filho, the permanent representative of Brazil to the United Nations. At the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ambassador Costa Filho served as the Undersecretary for Economic and Financial Affairs, where he acted as Sherpa of Brazil to the G20, Director of the Extra-Regional Trade Negotiations Department, and Head of the Services, Investments, and Financial Affairs Division, among other roles. Ambassador Ronaldo Costa Filho also served at the Brazilian delegation to the European Union in Brussels, the Brazilian Permanent Mission in Geneva, the Embassy of Brazil in Quito, and the Brazilian mission to the United Nations in New York, where he served for the first time from 1991 to 1995. So without further ado, it's a great pleasure, Ambassador, once again, to have you here at Columbia University.
Thank you very much. First of all, my gratitude, can you all hear me well? Gratitude to Columbia University, particularly Professor Sidney Nakamoto, for the invitation, and I'm deeply honored by the presence of Professor Fischlo here. Let me just say that I'm here. This is my first posting as head of mission. You will have seen from my resume that I started here, but my career took me in different paths. For over 20 years, I've been doing economic and trade affairs. So I'm back here now, and much as you, trying to learn a bit about Brazil and the United Nations. So I mean, I really enjoy this kind of discussion, and question and answers will be very welcome. Now, to start, I'm just going to give a very broad overview of Brazil and the United Nations, and then, as I say, I'm really open and ready to engage in this. Brazil is a country that does and has always highly valued diplomacy and multilateralism. And we could mention some very quick facts, like we have borders with 10 out of the 12 countries in South America. Our territory is about 50% of that, and yet we have lived in peace with all our neighbors for 150 years. And the stability of our borders is due in great measure to the Baron of Rio Branco, who is our mentor in the Foreign Service, and he personally negotiated a lot of these borders, always in a peaceful and non-confrontational manner. Another great icon we have is Rui Barbosa, who did represent Brazil at the Second Peace Conference in The Hague in 1907. And among the 175 delegates there, he became known as the Eagle of The Hague because he was very vocal and very firm about the concept of sovereign equality among all nations, which is something that lives on to this day. It's there in the Charter of the United Nations. It's an expression of idealism in many ways, because in reality, countries are not all the same, but it is an aspirational goal and one which we understand that has to continue guiding us in each and every action at the UN. So, as we say, Rio Branco was the father of our diplomacy. We like to say also that Rui Barbosa was the father of our multilateral diplomacy. So much so that Brazil is taking over the presidency of the Security Council in July. And during that month, we will have an exhibition on Rui Barbosa at the UN, which is something quite interesting. Brazil was in the First World War. In the Second World War, we sent troops to Italy. We were one of the founders of the League of Nations. So all of this, just to give a quick background that we are committed to multilateralism and to diplomacy. And we had a foreign minister in the 80s, Saraiva Guerreiro, who defined the fact that Brazil is a country that does not have a surplus of power. So we do not have military power, we do not have economic power with which to have our interests on the international scene furthered. So diplomacy and negotiation, multilateralism, these are all key concepts for us because it is what can assure that our interests are heard and taken into account on the international scene. Now, I mean, the UN came out of the Second World War, and if there's interest, we can talk a bit about why it came about and what happened. Why it's there. It's something new, this concept of multilateralism, and in particular the US role, which was very interesting in that if we remember after the First World War, the US retrenched to its default setting of isolationism and withdrew back from Europe. After the Second World War, there was a perception this was no longer an option, but we can talk a bit more about that later on. And so the UN came to be as an expression of a number of things. The first and perhaps most important is that it is a very efficient mechanism with which to have an administration of the international system. And it's efficient because, and I take the point of view of the US as the hegemonic power at that stage. It is a system which at once allows everyone, every member of the international community to sit at the table and feel that it is being heard and its views and interests are being taken into account. It is easier for the powerful to negotiate their interests, their norms with everyone at the same time, instead of having to go one by one in the international community. So it is a more efficient mechanism. And at the same time, it highlights the concept of democracy, which was such a powerful force in guiding the Allies in the Second World War. So I think the UN had all these concepts behind it, and it's important to note that it's not just the UN. This was a basic principle for organizing the international system post Second World War. So we have the UN here, we have the specialized agencies, many of which already existed pre-war. Things like the ILO was already there. I think the World Health Organization was already there. These were brought into the UN system, and you developed others like the international financial institutions in Washington, World Bank and IMF. The GATT WTO system was also conceived at the same in this same juncture. So it's a demonstration that this was an organizing principle of the international system post Second World War. Trying to get back to Brazil. Brazil is one of the 51 founding members of the Charter of the UN. And an interesting side note is that we in Brazil are very proud that very few women participated in the San Francisco Conference. A total of 4 women among the 160 delegates who signed the charter. Only 4 were women. One of them was Brazilian. Her name was Berta Lutz, and she was the main driver and proponent of the concept of gender equality. The initial drafts of the UN Charter spoke among equality of men. And she was the driver, equality between men and women. She is the author and the inspirer of that language, which was the first opportunity in which equal rights of men and women came to be recognized internationally. And for anyone who's interested, HBO has done a documentary on Berta Lutz. It's called Berta Lutz, Women in the UN Charter, which is interesting to see. We continued engaged in the UN from the very outset. Osvaldo Aranha, Brazilian diplomat, chaired the first session of the General Assembly in 1947. He chaired the second session of the United Nations General Assembly when he worked very tirelessly on the approval of the United Nations Partition Plan for Palestine. And this led to the creation of the State of Israel, for which he was nominated to the Nobel Peace Prize. And he is recognized to this day in Israel as an important figure in Israeli history. There is a square in Tel Aviv that is named after him, and a street, in Jerusalem, a street in Tel Aviv that's named in his honor. Professors mentioned here that Brazil traditionally opens the general debate in September, and there are a number of different stories explaining why Brazil should have this honor. Brazil traditionally is the first speaker, and the US is the host country, is the second speaker. There are theories that say this is a compensation for the fact that Brazil, who was considered to be a permanent member in the San Francisco negotiations and didn't get the spot, was given the opening speech as a kind of compensation. It doesn't sound right to us, particularly as it wasn't a constant in the early years. And Professor said late 40s, by our records, early 50s is when it began in earnest, and since then it's been an unbroken tradition. And there is, gratefully for us, there is a resolution adopted in the 1990s that says, in determining the order of speakers, due consideration will be given to tradition. And this is something that gives us a bit of comfort. Security Council. Brazil is on the council now. Brazil is tied with Japan for the most non-permanent stints in the council at 11. Japan will overtake us in June, it will probably be elected for its 12th session stint on the council. But this is, I think, a recognition of the value of our contribution to the UN and to the maintenance of international peace and security over the years. Let me just skip here, I'll come back. We have been a long time supporter of peacekeeping operations in the UN. I will find there's some members here. We led the operation in Haiti for 15 consecutive years with over 30,000 troops on the ground. We led the maritime force in Lebanon for 10 years. And we currently have the force commander in the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is the largest UN mission in operation. Of the 71 peacekeeping operations mandated by the UN, Brazil has sent troops in one way or another to 41 of them. All of this to see that, you know, these are Brazil is committed to the ideals of the UN, to the objective of trying to maintain international peace and security. We can talk a bit about the effectiveness of this later. I personally have a few question marks, particularly now that I'm sitting in the council, but we will get to that later. In the Security Council, just highlighting quickly a few of the issues that we ran our campaign on and which are priorities, which motivate us in our work. One of these is a strong commitment to what we call a women, peace and security agenda. This is something that's been highlighted at the UN and the Security Council for a number of years, and it aims to recognize the decisive contribution that women can make in all phases of a conflict. This includes boots on the ground, and we are particularly proud of the fact that we won. The UN has something called a UN Gender Advocacy Award in peacekeeping, and Brazilian female soldiers won that 2 years in a row, 2019 and 2020. And this is in recognition of their role in highlighting and being sensitive to gender issues in the context of peacekeeping operations. I will give you just one quick example of the utility of having women on the ground. There are, in any conflict situation, always reports of incidents of sexual violence against women in a conflict setting. For the women who are victims of this violence, it is much easier to approach another woman in the peacekeeping force than having to discuss this with a male soldier. So this is the kind of issue where women in the peacekeeping force have shown the utility. They have shown themselves to be much easier in communicating with the local population. So all of these facts lead to the women, peace and security agenda being so important, not to Brazil only, but to a number of countries in the process. And there are benchmarks that have been established. Members try to year on year increase the percentage of women they allocate to peacekeeping operations. But that's not just it. And the UN has always made a very strong point of trying to ensure that women also participate in the negotiation of the peace process. That the parties should have women on their delegations, so that women can play a role in the negotiation and in the substantive part of the peace process. Another of our priorities is strengthening the relationship between the Security Council and the Peace Building Commission. I don't know if I'm going through you in these.
That's totally fine.
Yeah, the UN, the Peace Building Commission set a body set up 15 years ago, whose objective was to try and bridge a gap between the peacekeeping part that is done by the Security Council and the regular development support done by the Economic and Social Council. So it's for countries that are transitioning out of conflict and into a more stable situation. The Peace Building Commission is the body that tries to lend a hand in this process of transition. And we have always felt that these two bodies should work much more in synchronicity with each other, which is so far not, it's not a disaster, but we could do more. And so, I mean, this is something we are trying to work in. Another issue that's very high on our agenda is the issue of, and it's very obvious today, which is the issue of protection of civilians in conflict situations. And all you have to look at is Ukraine, and what's going on there, and you see how important the concept of ensuring that international norms relating to protecting civilians, the application of international humanitarian law, how important all of this is in real life. So that's something we also try to highlight during our 2 years in the council. Security Council reform, many of the
That's totally fine.
United Nations Security Council reform. This is, the professor has highlighted a big priority for us. And I will explain why. The Security Council has 15 members, 5 of which are permanent. The US, Russia, China, the UK, and France. These 5 permanent members have what is known as the veto power, in that if they vote no to any resolution, it's rejected. And this has become a very visible topic now, because there was enormous frustration when Russia vetoed the first resolution on the issue of Ukraine. So let's get back to Security Council reform. 5 permanent and 10 who sit in a rotating basis for 2-year mandates. Brazil's contention in the process of reform, which, to give diplomacy its apt fame for being very slow, is a negotiation that's been going on for about 30 years. But Brazil's central contention here, not just Brazil, a number of other countries, is that the current composition of the Security Council reflects the world as it was in 1945, when you had 5 recognized major powers and 46 other countries, some developed, some developing. Over the years, today we are 193 member states. The majority of which, this increase, comes from the process of decolonization in Africa and in Asia. At the same time, a number of developing countries have become more important actors in the conduct of international relations. And I'll just quote myself because I feel good doing it. When I arrived 2 years ago, the first meeting of this forum to discuss Security Council reform, I said the process of updating structures of international governance is a necessity and it's ongoing. In the Bretton Woods institutions in Washington, the process is underway to rebalance, even if marginal, but to rebalance the voting shares among member states. As you know, in the IMF and the World Bank, it's not one man, one vote. It's a weighted voting system according to economic clout. So this is being rebalanced. In the global macroeconomic arena, the G7 in the 2008-2009 financial crisis realized it was incapable of dealing with a solution, with a situation on its own. And it brought in additional members and created, took over the G20 came into its own with countries such as China, Saudi Arabia, Brazil, Argentina, a number of countries, developing countries, because this represented perhaps 20 most largest economies in the world, and they got together and helped to solve the 2008-2009 crisis. And the point I made 2 years ago was this is ongoing in other fora. I hope it does not take a crisis of similar proportions in the political sphere to get us moving at the UN. And a few weeks back, we had another meeting, and I quoted myself there, and I said, I think we missed with the Ukraine, I think we missed a window of opportunity to having this process moving. We'll see. There is enormous resistance to this process. We can get into why and by who in the question and answer. I'm going to skip. I mean, if you want to talk about other issues on the agenda, I'm happy to do that. Sustainable development, human rights, COVID, a number of issues. I'm just going to skip straight to Ukraine because I know this is the hot topic. Just to say, no, I was questioned even in the press as to why Brazil took the different positions it took in the different resolutions that have been adopted on the issue of Ukraine. Because we voted in favor of the early resolutions and we abstained on this last resolution on the suspension of Russia from the Human Rights Council. And my response, my contention here is Brazil has been absolutely coherent and consistent in its position from beginning to end. From beginning to end, we have said Russia has crossed a red line. It has violated the sovereignty of Ukraine. It has violated the territorial integrity of Ukraine. It has violated international law. And it has violated the Charter of the United Nations. This is why we voted in favor at the Security Council. We voted in favor of submitting it to the General Assembly after the Russian veto. We voted in favor of the resolution in the General Assembly. When it came to the resolution on suspension of Russia from the Human Rights Council, just to go back, throughout this process, we have always been stressing, yes, these facts are deplorable, but diplomacy must be put into effect. The Security Council is here to sit down and discuss and negotiate and look for a way out, and it's not been doing that. So when we come to the General Assembly to consider the suspension of Russia, Brazil's position is also consistent with its attachment to multilateralism, i.e., kicking someone off the team is not helpful for me to talk to. The only way I'm going to find a solution to the problem is through discussion, negotiation. If I refuse to talk with someone, I am refusing a negotiated solution. So that's why we abstained. And as I say, this is, we understand true to our attachment to the principles that govern international relations, multilateralism, and the UN itself. Here I will stop, and I'm sure there are one or two questions.
Oh, absolutely. And before we get into the Q&A, we are very pleased to have Professor Albert Fischlo here, Professor Emeritus Albert Fischlo, who is going to be providing some initial comments to kick off the discussion.
Brazil's engagement in international relations, as the ambassador has argued, has been a very substantial one, especially when you consider that Brazil as a country lagged behind other countries in terms of income per capita. And it was Argentina, which was the principal country in Latin America, much more than Brazil over that period of time. So that was one of the points that I think is quite important. A second degree of importance was the disappointment with regard to the League of Nations. The failure of the attempt to construct a model institution that, by permitting multilateralism at a time when countries were adapting and adjusting from a circumstance of the enormous commitment that they had previously had to colonialism. And it was really the Russian Revolution which created a fundamental difference in that respect, and provided for the first time the notion that things were very different because a country that had been run by a czar and had passed along the challenges, which were considerable, as a country tried to modernize. That circumstance and event was a formal problem for Brazil itself, because here was a country that became known for its problems and its difficulties in negotiation all through the 1930s, and its commitment to ending colonialism. That, after all, was the great message of Lenin. This is what his message to the world was, that the Russian Revolution was the beginning of a process which would see the end of capitalism itself. And for Brazil, this set in motion internally a problem of adjusting to a left in Brazil that has not always or continuously been able to satisfy the relationship. So I put that out as a reality, and one of the characteristics that is perhaps worthy of more discussion. The second point that I would make is that peacekeeping missions became progressively more difficult over time. The first circumstances in terms of the Belgian Congo, where one was initially concerned about Belgium's control of an area under its influence, and how to deal with that was a real problem that was never altogether resolved, in part because decolonialization also lent itself to the creation of national governments, which did not follow democratic rules. You had a circumstance where over the period, the great period in which this occurred, was the period of the 1950s, as British rule became challenged, French rule became challenged, and the German rule that had existed earlier, that had been tried to be dealt with in the context of South Africa, was also a major problem. And those were critical issues and problems. And if I may say, Brazil's commitment to discussion diplomacy, idealism, rather than realism, was a problem during that period of decolonialization. The final observation that I would make, that is the change in Brazilian policy during the 50s and early 60s, which was the economic problems that occurred within Brazil. The issue of the left in Brazil and how it was going to interact with other countries, and in particular created problems dealing with the United States. I will say that the change in Brazil with the military intervention that occurred in 1964 brought to an end the notion of the Alliance for Progress. The Alliance for Progress was set up immediately after Castro's Cuba. And it was set up in order to engage all of the countries of Latin America in trying peacefully to evolve in a way that would be consistent with what was going on. And those of you with an interest in Brazil will, of course, know about Celso Furtado at that time, and his attempts to create a plan that was to try to avoid precisely what happened with military intervention. In the case of Brazil, set off a period of time in which relationships with the United States were central. And they became especially central as the United States sought to deal directly with Brazil. Brazil had at that time the second largest aid program developed by the United States before it had the intervention in Vietnam. And the whole problem of how Brazil was going to relate to what was happening there and what was going on in Latin America with the Peronist revolution that happened is a central part of Brazilian experience where it was difficult for Brazil to relate multilaterally. It was difficult. So I will stop there and not go on to talk about the Ukraine or other matters, but the ambassador may wish to respond or wait later to the end.
And we'll save the best for the last, Professor. Well, thanks so much. Professor Fish will provide a great historical perspective that in fact complements the discussion that it was initiated by Ambassador. And if I may, Ambassador, Professor Fish outlined several ups and downs and so many changes that Brazil went through over the past century. At the same time, Brazilian diplomacy has been very consistent, right? And I think it's one of the pillars of Brazilian diplomacy. It is to be predictable. It is to prioritize the long run. To what extent do you believe that that's still the case, and how have you seen Itamaraty, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, adapting to these changing circumstances in Brazil and in the world?
That's a very complex question. No, let me say, I think the starting point for this is that foreign affairs have never been a central point of interest in Brazilian public opinion. It's, it was never an issue. Foreign policy for many years referred essentially to the price of coffee on international markets, the price of sugar, and how we could do this. There was no engagement, even within the government. The sectoral agencies were not really concerned about international affairs. This allowed Itamaraty to have a monopoly on the implementation of Brazilian foreign policy, which gave it the stability and this predictability you mentioned, Professor. Over the past 20, 30 years, there has been an increasing interest in foreign policy in all levels. I mean, this is other government agencies, the private sector, civil society. All of these have discovered a bit that there is a big, wide world out there with challenges and opportunities. And this has made the design and implementation of a stable, predictable foreign policy much more difficult, because now you have inputs, you have people pulling you this way and that, and egging you on this way and that. And so we try, but it's not always easy to be stable and predictable.
Ambassador, before we conclude the first part of the session here, Brazilian diplomats are very famous for being effective and some of the most skilled civil servants in the world. And you mentioned that you quoted Saraiva Guerreiro, Ambassador Saraiva Guerreiro, and that because of lack of surplus of power, Brazil has the ability of being affected to a large extent because of the ability of our diplomatic body to punch above its weight. Why does that happen?
I could not tell you comparatively, but we have a very structured bureaucracy in the Foreign Service. I tell people, and from other countries, and most of them are amazed, there are 2 jobs in the Foreign Ministry which are open to non-diplomats. And that's the minister and the legal counsel. Everybody else has to be a career diplomat. Yes, we have political appointments as ambassadors, but that's very, very sparing. Right now, we have 2 ambassadors who are non-career officials, and maybe a 3rd one career. So you see, it's very rare. We have a training institute since the 40s. Which has trained and educated every single Brazilian diplomat system. So we have the training, the preparation. We place enormous value on learning by doing. So young diplomats are assigned to follow a negotiation with a more experienced colleague. Not because they're going to have an input, but because they are learning. They are seeing how things are done. And this gives some predictability because you're learning from the succeeding generations. But it also allows a period of training of foreign service personnel, which is extraordinarily useful. Not to mention that the entrance exams to the Foreign Service are considered among the toughest in Brazil. It's not an easy thing to get into the Foreign Service. So I think all of this contributes to some modest achievements which we've had over the years.
Ambassador Ronaldo Costa Filho, thanks so much. We're finalizing the first part of our session today. I just wanted to thank everyone who joined us online and who were with us throughout the semester. This is the closing session of our academic year, so we're finalizing our academic year in a high note. I also wanted to thank Professor Fischl for being with us for this closing session, and to secretaries Fabio Coelho and Tiago Oliveira from the mission and Brazilian mission to the United Nations, and from the Brazilian Consulate here in New York for helping us organize this session. Thanks so much, everyone. And Anna, thank you for assisting us throughout the semester. And we can end the transmission now.
Yeah, I'm gonna stop the transmission just now. Yeah, it's always a pleasure. I'm so sorry that I can't be there for the last lecture and dinner, but it was very nice meeting you online. I hope the rest of the semester goes well, and I'll see you